Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. If you watched my chocolate making video, you know that I bought some Star Wars themed candy molds to make a craft. So for example, here's the R2-D2 one. Here are some Stormtrooper helmets. And today we're going to make that craft. It's a May the 4th be with you craft. And it's not lost on me that May the 4th is the day before Cinco de Mayo. So I'm going to draw some inspiration from Cinco de Mayo for this craft. Let's go have some fun. My idea for this craft is to make quote-unquote stones, which tell part of the story from the Star Wars movies. And as an inspiration for what these stones should look like, I'm drawing from the Aztec sunstone. So to get the Star Wars images, I purchased these candy molds and ice cube molds from Amazon. And because the price was the best there that I saw, I'm going to include a link in the description. The ice cube mold is the Imperial Walkers and the Imperial Star Cruisers, but then all the other molds come together in a set, and that includes Boba Fett and the Mandalorian symbol, or the Boba Fett helmet and the Mandalorian symbol, Han Solo in carbonite, the Millennium Falcon, Darth Vader helmets, Stormtrooper helmets, R2-D2s, and X-Wings. I'm also going to be using this cake mold, which I bought at the Dollar Tree. And you can use an aluminum foil cake mold if you want to. I like this one because the sides are smooth. They're not crimped like an aluminum foil cake mold. Or you could also use a square shape cake mold if you wanted to. This was the shape that I wanted to use, and this worked well. I did also use an aluminum foil mold, and it did also work. I'm also going to use plaster of Paris primarily to make this, and Model Magic or homemade air dry clay. I used homemade air dry clay, but that did not work so well, and I'll show you how I used it and how it didn't work so well. So you might want to use just the plaster of Paris. To make the air dry clay, if you choose to use it, mix 2 parts baking soda with 1 part cornstarch and 1 part water. Mix it thoroughly, then heat it on the stove over medium heat, stirring constantly until it forms a clay. I would then wrap that clay tightly in plastic wrap so that it stays fresh. I was able to successfully mold with the air dry clay with many of the molds. I could make the Imperial Star Cruiser, I could make Han Solo in carbonite, the Darth Vader helmets, the Boba Fett helmets and Mandalorian symbols, the Millennium Falcon, and the Stormtrooper helmets. I was not able to make R2-D2, the X-Wings, or the Imperial Walkers because the pieces were too small and broke off. But for all of them, I was able to very easily mold them with plaster of Paris. So when you're using the plaster of Paris, follow the instructions on the package. You are not supposed to inhale the plaster of Paris powder, so please wear a mask and work in a well-ventilated area when you're working with this. I wore my respirator every time I worked with the plaster of Paris powder because I have a respirator, and why not err on the side of caution? So what you're going to do is just mix up your plaster of Paris and fill the molds that you want to use, first of all. The appearance of the sunstone is a central figure with other symbols radiating from the central figure. So that was what I wanted to imitate with my stones. So at the center of one of my stones, I have the Millennium Falcon, and that stone basically tells the story of Han Solo being encased in carbonite. So you'll see how I made my stones, but you of course might want to make something completely different, not Star Wars themed at all. And you could use any candy molder or any objects really to make one of these stones. So once I'd had all of my pieces, what I did was I used some baby oil and oiled the bottom of my cake pan. I never tried to do this without oiling the bottom of the cake pan, so I have no idea if that's necessary. Most of my pieces came out really easily. One of them I was a little concerned wasn't going to come out, but eventually it did. This is an 8-inch cake pan, and I used 1.5 cups of plaster of Paris, the dry plaster of Paris, and then half that amount of water, so 3/4 of a cup of water. The plaster of Paris dries very quickly or starts to cure very quickly, you have about 6 to 10 minutes to work with it. So you want to stir it up quickly and pour it into the mold. Before you do that, I would recommend having your shape planned out and all your pieces ready to put inside the cake pan. The first way I tried to do this, which did not work at all, was to lay the pieces down in the cake pan and then put the plaster of Paris around and between the pieces. It simply wasn't fluid enough to flow and fill in all the spaces between the pieces. So the better way to do this is to fill the pan with your 1.5 cups of the plaster of Paris mixture and then press the pieces down into the mixture. Now, I really wanted some other symbols besides just the large pieces. I wanted some smaller symbols. And Star Wars technology has a particular look to it. So I didn't think there was any sort of Earth hardware that I could place in here that would look right. So what I decided to do was to try to mold pieces of the R2-D2. So there's a large R2-D2 that comes with the smaller R2-D2s. So what I did was I pressed the air dry clay into the larger R2-D2 just to get certain pieces of the technology that's on R2-D2 that I could then use in the mold. So there are 8 spaces between most of my pieces, just the way they fit in the mold. So I wanted 8 pieces of little tech to put between the larger pieces. I also thought that I would really like to have either stars or snowflakes for Hoth and stars for the ones that are more sort of in space. And there aren't any star-shaped beads that I thought were the right shape, but I do have these coastal charms. And I thought that the compass rose in the compass charms was actually the exact star shape that I wanted. It's reminiscent of the original Star Wars poster, which has a sort of a star shape on it that is like this. So I pressed Model Magic onto that compass rose and then cut out around it with an X-Acto knife to get a circle with the star inside of it. Now the air dry clay takes a while to dry. So first of all, you have to let it dry completely for this to work at all. But even if it doesn't dry completely, it's still not going to work well. Because what I've found is that the air dry clay and the plaster just don't work well together. When I put the air dry clay into the plaster, at first it seemed fine, but then as the plaster dried, it moved away from the air dry clay, and I don't know if that's because of liquid that's still in the air dry clay, or if there's some chemical interaction between what's in the air dry clay and what's in the plaster. So what I did was glued those air dry clay pieces back in after the plaster dried. And once the plaster has dried, then if you just press the bottom of the cake pan, eventually the piece will pop a little bit, and then you can just gently turn it upside down with your hand on the piece, and it should come right out. Like I said, all of mine came out except one. I just had a little more trouble with it. It just took me a little more time to get it to pop, but they all did come out just fine. So I made 3, and the first one I already described. The second one is the story of Hoth. So I put an Imperial Walker or AT-AT in the middle of that one, and R2-D2s and X-Wings around it, and then I put the little stars in between the X-Wings and the R2-D2s. For the final stone, I wanted to do sort of story of the Empire, not because I admire the Empire, but just because I have some nice pieces. So I was going to use the Stormtrooper helmets and the Imperial Star Cruisers, because they're shaped like arrows, and so they point. For all of these, if I had something that was more arrow-shaped, I put that at the compass points to look more like the Aztec sunstone. But I really wanted a Death Star for the middle of that, and I looked around. I think there are like Death Star ice cube trays, but they're very expensive, so I decided I would try to carve my own Death Star. So I took a measuring cup and poured some plaster of Paris into the bottom of that to give me a circle. And then I just used an X-Acto knife, basically, and I also used my needle nose pliers just to drag lines through the Death Star. I did try to make a little cone out of Model Magic and put it into the middle to get it to give me that sort of satellite dish where the weapon is on the Death Star. And that worked pretty well, but of course the plaster of Paris pulled away from it, so it was a little messy. But it did give me that satellite dishy thing on the Death Star, and I just looked at a picture of the Death Star and dragged out some lines on it that somewhat resembled the picture. So for my final one, I have the Death Star and the Star Cruisers, the Stormtrooper helmets, and then those pieces of tech that I made from pressing into my R2-D2 with Model Magic. So once these were all finished and dried, I needed to paint them. And I had originally thought I would just paint them as sort of a chalk color and sort of age them. And I practiced. I made one that was a disaster, the one where I tried to put the pieces down and then pour the plaster of Paris over them. So I had that piece to experiment on. So I practiced with a number of colors and different techniques, and I came up with 3 ideas for these based on those techniques. So for the Hoth stone, I'm going to start with this Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint in Salmon Coral. I know I really should have done this one white and snowy, but I just didn't want to be that boring with any of them. And I'm just going to paint the entire thing with this chalk paint. Once that is completely dry, I'm going to take this burnt umber paint and mix it with water and wash that over the entire thing. And then finally, I have this Folk Art metallic in bronze metal, and I'm going to use that to give this some highlights. So I used a very fine brush, and I basically used it to highlight the R2-D2 tech and some of the tech on the X-Wings and the AT-AT. Now for the Imperial Stone, I'm using one of my absolute favorite colors, which is the Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint in Cascade. And I'm going to start by painting the entire stone with this color. And then for the next step, here I have some acrylic paint. It's mostly black, but I mixed a little bit of white in to give me a gray acrylic paint. And I've sprayed a lot of water into that, and I'm washing that over the blue and then dabbing it off with a paper towel. So do make sure the blue paint is completely dry before you do this. And with this one, I did the same thing as the last one. I took the Folk Art metallic paint in bronze metal and highlighted some of the features. So I highlighted some of that R2-D2 tech that I put on this one. I did the eyes of the Stormtrooper helmets, and I just highlighted some of the tech on the Imperial Star Cruisers. And then I painted a bronze-colored border around the edge of the piece. Now this piece, the story of Han Solo being encased in carbonite, this was my piece that did not go well. So what I did for this piece was I started by washing over it with some gray paint. So I took some black acrylic, mixed a little bit of white in, mixed a lot of water, and washed that over the whole piece. Now you can see it's very messy, and I think that's partly because this piece broke in 2 pieces and I had to glue it back together. Also, the Millennium Falcon in the middle is Model Magic or air dry clay, and that fell out. I had to glue that in. So I think that the paint just didn't adhere where there was glue. But this piece, ultimately, within the day that I painted it, grew mold, I think. And I think that might be because I got it wet. I didn't protect it with chalk paint before I washed a paint over it. I don't know. I wasn't able to salvage it, but I thought I would show it to you. I ended up painting over this gray wash anyway because it came out so badly. So what I would say is paint it with a dark gray chalk paint first. So what I then did was I took my Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint in Cascade, and I brushed that over the Boba Fett helmets, and I brushed it over the Mandalorian symbols. But I made sure I didn't cover them completely, so it let some of that dark paint show through where the cracks are. And I really loved the way it looked. I'm really sad that this piece got destroyed. I then thought that the parts that represented Han Solo I might paint with this Folk Art metallic in silver sterling, although I'm not thrilled with the way this color came out. But what I did was I painted basically the Millennium Falcon and the Han Solo encased in carbonite, and I also did Darth Vader's eyes, because that is going to look kind of cool when we put another color on the helmet. So I used this Folk Art multi-surface in chocolate brown to paint the Darth Vader helmets. Everything except the eyes. And then I also used it to give some detail to the Mandalorian symbol, the sort of the, I don't know, tusks of the mythosaur, the eyes of the Boba Fett helmet, and I painted down the sides of the Han Solo encased in carbonite and some of the features of the Millennium Falcon. And then finally, I just mixed a dark gray paint, did not mix water into it, and painted all the areas where I had washed the paint over before, just because it looked so terrible. And I had originally planned to dry brush over this with some white, but I decided I didn't want to do that, so that's why I painted it dark gray. So here, as I'm finishing the painting, that's the only view we get of this piece finished, because by the time I finished the other two, and was ready to take pictures of them, this one had grown some fuzzy mold. Quite amazing. It is no longer in the house. And for a final touch for the Hoth stone, I just felt like it needed something around the edge. So I just took some of the jute-colored rope from the Dollar Tree, and I whipped the ends of the rope together. So I cut it so that it would fit exactly around this piece, and then used a little bit of masking tape, laid the two ends of the rope on the masking tape, and wrapped the masking tape around them. And then I used some jute twine to whip it. And then once that was whipped together, I placed that seam at the bottom, and I used hot glue to glue it around the piece. So here are the two remaining pieces. So what did you think of our Star Wars themed story stones? Did you have a favorite? If so, please tell me in the comments. I did like the one that got all moldy, so that was a little bit sad. But between the other two, I'm not sure if I do have a favorite. I do love the colors. I liked the gold edging that I put on this one. So for me, it's a toss-up. I really do like both of them. And I think that this is a really fun project that you could do with any sort of shapes that are meaningful to you. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.